Let's talk about every millennial's favorite topic, problems. Most people are aware that there are more than a handful of national and global issues going on right now, and that there are vocal activists for all of them. Right now, people are hyper-focused on things like Trump, gun control, women's LGBT and animal rights, fascism, socialism, capitalism, Black Lives Matter, healthcare, sexual abuse, poverty, abortion, famine, death penalty, artificial intelligence, automation, digital privacy, nuclear war, mental health, cell phone addiction. The list goes on. But there's one issue that is arguably more important than all of the others combined, because it doesn't just affect one marginalized group or even one whole nation. It affects every human of every age, every gender, race, and income level. And the threat isn't about fairness or morals, it's about survival. Humanity's number one issue is something you've most likely heard of, but chances are you only know one half of the story. Partially because of headlines and articles like this from The Guardian. Just 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions, study says. Now, this type of narrative is incredibly dangerous for two reasons. It's telling you what the problem is and who the bad guys are, and it's wrong about both. But we'll get back to that in a moment. If you haven't figured it out yet, the issue we'll be talking about tonight is related to fossil fuels. Coal, oil, and natural gas. Millions of years ago, all over the world, large, shallow lakes of plankton and algae absorbed energy from the sun, and after being trapped by sediment and millions of years of geological heat and pressure, this ancient energy goop separated and formed into the three states of matter that you learned about in your first science class with Bill Nye: solid, liquid, and gas. We call these coal, oil, and natural gas. And they all have the same hydrocarbons and polymers that make them so valuable. But when it comes to fossil fuels, the media focuses on the mess, which is basically a combination of destruction and pollution, right? What we add and subtract to the planet. Most of these messy terms you're familiar with fall into categories like climate, waste, death, and marketing. So climate buzzwords are things like global warming, climate change, environmental issues, natural disasters, greenhouse gases, acid rain, ozone, sea levels, etc. Waste buzzwords are things like pollution, landfills, carbon emissions, oil spills, single-use plastic. Death buzzwords are things like biodiversity loss, deforestation, overfishing, polar bears, honeybees, coral reefs. And lastly, marketing buzzwords are things like green, sustainable, carbon footprint, eco-friendly. You get the idea. All of these terms are about the mess. But the biggest problem for our species is not actually the mess, but the other side of the coin: fossil fuel addiction. Where did it all start? The Industrial Revolution, less than 200 years ago. This shit was like steroids. All right, the planet went from 1 billion people to 7.5 billion, and it's estimated to go up to 10. Fossil fuels started out as luxuries, but they became infrastructural necessities so massive that they are currently irreplaceable by anything in existence. The shoes are simply too huge to fill. They became the lungs and veins of our entire society. Let me explain. Our fossil fuels addiction falls into two categories: energy and materials. The energy we need comes in the forms of electricity, fire, and explosion. Historically, our only energy source was biofuel like wood or whale fat. Everything else is fairly new. So starting with coal, many people aren't even aware that electricity actually isn't clean. It comes mostly from burning coal and natural gas to boil water, turn turbines and generators inside of steam engines. Coal is the leading source of electricity, actually at 38%. A lot of people also don't consider where metal comes from. Right, metal starts as ore, which just means it's mixed up in other rocks and shit, and you gotta grind it up and melt it out with a shitload of heat, which comes from a shitload of coal. 74% of production of steel and other essential metals is made possible by this burning of coal. And as always, coal powers some steam engines for transportation and other infrastructural machines. Moving on to oil. Now, oil can be burned to heat water and power a steam engine to generate electricity too, but it's rarely used that way. Oil's baby is the internal combustion engine. Oil is the explosive power source of almost all movement around the world. Civilian cars, business trucks, passenger airplanes, cargo ships, freight trains, farming equipment, construction equipment, rockets, and more. In other words, food, business, buildings, travel, global trade, the chance to escape Earth's gravity in the future are highly, highly dependent on oil. For example, there are thousands of cargo ships that push our essential goods across the world's oceans every day, and the engines alone are 4 stories high and have over 100,000 horsepower, consuming over 16 tons of diesel fuel every hour. Global trade is the lifeblood of our species, and we can't replace that kind of energy with wind and solar. It's just not possible at the scales that we need. Lastly, natural gas. Burning natural gas is the second largest source of electricity at 23%. Keep in mind, with coal, that's over half of all of our electricity coming from fossil fuels. Natural gas also gives us indoor heating, water heating, oven and stovetop cooking, and even lighting for some streets and fuel for some engines. But energy is only half of the addiction. Let's talk about materials. Coal gives us essential goods like fertilizers, soap, aspirin, water filters, resins, and cosmetics. But oil is what we're most addicted to. When crude oil goes to the factory, it's separated into different layers of density, and well, they're used for different things basically. So at the bottom is tar, asphalt, which is every paved road, every blacktop, most roofs. Oil also gives us all tires, right? Synthetic rubber, all industrial fertilizers and pesticides that make massively efficient food production possible, all plastics, paint, plumbing pipes, heating oil, radiator coolant, chemical feedstock for most modern medicine, food packaging to keep food fresh, right? Waxes, glues, lubricants, solar panels, and almost all consumer products that you have ever come in contact with. Lastly, natural gas. Natural gas is mostly burned, but it also provides chemical feedstocks for plastics and medicines. Now, some of the uses for these materials in our society will be easy to replace or do without, like plastic straws. But that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of our addiction. Let's be clear on what kind of addiction this is. Okay, this isn't a habitual addiction. It's a biological one. Right? If you quit weed and Netflix cold turkey right now, it's not going to kill you. You might realize your late night cooking sucks and you'll never know what happens in season 4, but there's still a 0% chance of death. On the other hand, if our global society quit fossil fuels overnight, without all that energy and material, society would likely start to collapse pretty quickly, and your chance of death would be uncomfortably high. In fact, if you're in a wealthy society right now, you're more at risk than someone who lives in a developing economy because you're more addicted. You know, the withdrawals are far more dangerous. So the big question that emerges from this realization of dependence is, how much time do we have before shit runs out, right? Because remember, these fossil fuels are formed over millions of years, much slower than the rate we're consuming them at, which makes them non-renewable resources. And the BP Statistical Review of World Energy is an in-depth annual look at the state of the world's energy crisis. It's very intuitively designed and full of useful information. I highly recommend checking it out. The link for it will be in the description, along with links for other articles and things. But with detailed data submitted from countries around the globe, the review estimates on average we have 50 years worth of oil, 53 years of natural gas, and 134 years of coal. And those numbers are subject to shrink when we add an additional 3 billion people to the planet, and they're subject to grow a little bit if we discover a few more oil fields before running out. But that doesn't change the fact that we are going to run out. And when pockets of the landscape start to run out of fossil fuels, it will be the kindling for global conflict. And this has happened before in history. I don't think anyone wants to see a future where all nations are grasping for breath, willing to do whatever it takes to keep their people alive. Except maybe this guy. But this isn't some far out doomsday theory. This is science, this is math, and if there will be a third world war, it will most likely be because of our fossil fuel addiction. We discussed the reality of our problems now. Okay, so let's talk about how the story is being told and how that affects your actions and in turn your future. Back to that article from earlier. Just 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions. So this article is arguing that the mess is the problem and that the bad guys are oil companies and politicians and that the good guys are anyone who sits back and complains about it. But that's like marching down the street with a sign that says, "Mike from Bevmo keeps selling me beer and I keep ruining my life with it. Put him in jail or make him fix my marriage." All right, it's time to grow up and stop blaming our drug dealers, especially for our messy room. The addiction itself is the problem, and the bad guy is you. You have roughly 50 years to sober up. Figure it out. Or you and possibly your loved ones are at risk of death.